Hello, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be finishing the Object 279 kit that we started last time, starting with these tracks, which are individual links, but yet still not posable, so they have to be glued all together, which is quite the process, as you'll soon see. As well, we're going to be adding some 3D printed details, as I do, and getting a lot of nice little things done in this kit. But before we do all that, we're going to deal with those tracks. Jumping into the tracks, we're of course going to have to cut them off the sprues. And now, because this tank has of course 4 tracks, it took quite a while because there were 84 links per track for 4 tracks. So cutting them out takes quite a long time and really kind of sucked. But the good thing is these tracks are decently made. They didn't have too much flash on them, so most of them didn't require any real cleanup, and cutting them off, they didn't need much. So skipping ahead, you can see the pile of tracks. And cutting those out, we'll have 1 track done, which you can see here. Remember, this is 1 out of 4 tracks. Quite a lot of little links. And then some of them do require a little bit of cleanup, just getting all the little pieces off, sanding down the edges, making sure all those sprue gates are off, as well as any ejector pin marks that may be exposed on them are sanded down, made to look nice. Even though eventually we will be covering most of the tracks with mud and weathering details, but starting out we're going to glue them all together in a big line in roughly the length of the underside or top sides of the tracks. Now, these tracks I was originally going to do them separately and have them off, but they ended up being such a hassle, I had to glue them directly onto the tank, and then in the next episode, we'll paint them all on. So you can see here, continuing on, still doing tracks, because once again, there's way too many of them in this kit. And this is probably much the biggest problem with this kit. They're all individual links. They're not posable. I had considered making them articulated and working, but just the size of them, you really can't do that. So after we get those tracks glued together in a line, we can kind of bend them around and shape them up while the glue is still soft. So gluing the links together, make them still soft. Then we're going to glue those pontoons back onto the tank, as I'd initially left them off because I did think I would be painting it without them on, but like I said, with how complicated and problematic these tracks are, I decided to just glue them all on and glue everything up together, and then take a little bit extra time while airbrushing it to airbrush them all individually while still on the tank. Like I say, I will be covering most of this stuff with weathering and mud details and all that, so it won't really show off that much that they're not painted all separately and perfectly. So, getting on to actually gluing these tracks on, I'm going to cover the road wheels and all of the contact points with some cement, and then thread the tracks through, getting them put on nicely, and kind of putting pressure, gluing them up. You can see here the track sections are already pre-bent because I had tried to form them off the tank and then glue them on later, but since that really wasn't working out, just decided to glue them on completely. And even in these long lengths, they were still pretty darn fiddly and annoying to work with. So I was kind of happy to just glue them on and be done with working with them. So that's what I ended up doing. And moving on to the outside ones, which were of course a lot easier because those inside tracks on this tank are very hard to get to, obviously, as they're inside and they're kind of hidden by those pontoon pieces that surround them, as of course this is a very interesting tank design and really unique to how all of it works. It's really a different system. Don't know if it would have worked or been any practical in real life if they had ever actually put this tank into service, but since they never really did, I guess we'll never really know how the system really would have worked in real life. Although I can see a lot of areas where it would have probably get clogged up with mud and just really kind of broken down and been a lot of problems. They had done this in an attempt to solve the weight issues that this tank would have had, as it was an incredibly heavy tank, so spreading out all that weight over 4 tracks might have helped, but it may have just been a big hindrance. Once again, it was never really put into service, so we'll never really know. Still working on all the tracks here. We're finally getting the last ones done. Doing the front piece, just kind of putting it together in individual sections, just fitting them all up, making sure they're all glued down well, and putting all of those pieces on, getting them sitting and fit up nice. In some areas here, I ended up actually using a less thick version of Tamiya glue, just their standard plastic cement, but it was generally pretty fine and got them mostly on. So after the tracks are now finally done, we're going to move on to getting those 3D printed details prepped. Now, the barrels here that I'll be putting on the back of the tank, they had some issues in printing where the supports kind of messed up the bases. So just filling those in with some Tamiya epoxy putty, getting them nice and filled out. Then after that dries, we'll of course be sanding it down. So while we wait for the putty on those barrels to dry, we're going to start preparing some of the other 3D printed details. Now, this is a log piece that I'll be putting on the back of the tank because, if you've ever seen any Russian tanks, most of them have a log on the back of them, and this is often used to help get traction or just do anything that you would need a big heavy-duty log for. So, as nice as this 3D printed piece is, and it looks like a log, it really didn't have any texture. So I took a nice fine razor saw and really started scraping down the edges, making a nice wood grain texture and really adding a lot of detail to it. And I'll be doing the same here on these ammo crates and boxes that I also printed off. They have good amounts of detail, but of course, adding a little bit of wood grain texture and just visual interest to them really helps kind of sell that they're actually wood and not just 3D printed plastic. So now, my nightmare has returned, and the tracks are back. These are some of the extra tracks I had after building it, and so, not wanting to let them go to waste, I'm going to use them as extra pieces to glue onto the tank, just to make things look kind of nice. So, this will be a lot easier than gluing the actual tracks themselves, because I only need to do small little sections, and they'll go together nicely, and I don't have to worry about putting them onto drive wheels. So, I just glued them all together, making sure they fit up nicely, and will look all good together once put onto the tank. Now, while the glue is still wet, just going and fitting them up, kind of curving them and contouring them to the parts of the tank that they'll be going on, and making sure they look all good. I just kind of put these in areas that are open enough, and you would think that tankers would probably store those tracks in extra. Now, we're on to the tow cable that came included with this kit. This is a very nice one, it's actual metal, just making sure it fits up into the tow link before adding any super glue, just to make sure that it's all going to work, or if you're going to need to trim anything. It's a pretty important thing to do because you don't want to put super glue in, try and fit it up, and then realize that it won't fit, which I've done before, and it's not very fun. But lessons learned, and just to finish it up, we'll put some tweezers on it, just kind of pushing the cable in, making sure it's fitting up all nice. And now we're on to some of the final details on the tank itself. This will be just adding in some reflective paint inside the buckets of the headlights, just so that once we put the clear plastic pieces over top of them, they'll have that little reflective glow that normal lights actually do have. So once we get that paint in, we'll of course be moving on to the actual clear plastic pieces. Now, I try and not snip these off the sprues very tightly and clean them up with a knife more, because it helps not get any stress fractures or imperfections in the actual clear part itself. So after cleaning them up with a knife, I go and glue them on just using some super glue, once again not wanting to deform the plastic or mess it up with any normal cement filler glue. After they're glued on, I'll be, for the first time, using some liquid masking to mask them off and keep them tight. Now, I haven't pulled this masking stuff off yet, but it did go on very well, and even when it was a little bit off, it was pretty easy to clean, as you saw there. And it really goes on pretty well. Like I say, I have yet to pull it off the model, so you'll have to wait until the next episode, once I'm done painting and everything, to see how this masking worked and how it was. Then, we're on to some of the final details of the kit, just fixing up stuff and making it ready for paint, actually. So, on those turret edges, we had some issues with fitment, so I filled them up with more of the Tamiya epoxy putty, and then after that was dried out, I sanded them down and got them clean and nice looking. I didn't want to go completely flat because, of course, this tank would have been a casted turret and a casted hull, so flattening them out would have not made them look right, so leaving them kind of gridded up and stuff, and then coming in with a higher piece of sandpaper just to kind of polish it out and make it look good and make it look like it's just another piece, and that anywhere that we can't fix out is just a casting error on the model. So we're on to the final bit here, the barrel. Now, this barrel is a pretty good one. I could have 3D printed a fully one-piece one, or some people make some nice metal ones, but I decided to just use the normal barrel since it looks pretty good, and with not a lot of sanding and not a lot of work, it turns down pretty well and looks pretty good. Being quite nice and smooth. It might not be as good as a metal barrel, but it'll do just fine. So now that we have that all nice and shaped up, we're of course going to glue it on the kit. Just the same old method of gluing anything onto these kits, some cement, and just making sure it's fit up. Now, of course, before I glued it on, I made sure it fit up well and good, and of course, once putting all the glue on, it fit up great. So now we're going to do a little bit of extra paint prep by just taking some extra skewers here, putting a little bit of super glue on them, and gluing those little extra details that I want painted in a different color from the main tank, and holding them on for a bit until they dry. And there you go, you have a nice little way to hold pieces, and we're going to do the exact same thing with the tracks, doing it on the underside of course, because they'll be glued face down onto the model, where the hole in the paint caused by the skewer really won't be seen. And that's the biggest part when gluing pieces onto skewers and holders, is making sure that you're gluing them or taping them in areas that won't be seen later on. So with that, we're basically done the episode for today. Now, this kit came together pretty well, but we'll have to see how it does with sanding and weathering. The details look nice, but as I said, those tracks are still a major pain and detractor to this kit. But tune in next time for when I get this kit painted and kind of start to do some of the paint weathering steps. Until then, if you don't want to miss that episode, subscribe, like if you liked the video, and go and check out my Instagram. I'm going to be posting a lot more in-progress stuff on there, and the link's in the description. And if you have any comments or questions, feel free to comment, and see you in the next one.